Welcome to Press for Democracy. I'm Janice Markham. Today our guest is Professor Peter Dreier. Dr. Dreier is E.P. Clapp Distinguished Professor of Politics and Chair of the Urban and Environmental Policy Department at Occidental College in Los Angeles. The courses Professor Dreier has taught include Movements for Social Justice, Community Organization and Leadership, and Jobs and Justice, the Labor Movement and American Culture. He writes regularly for the Los Angeles Times, The Nation, American Prospect, and the Huffington Post. His latest book, The 100 Greatest Americans of the 20th Century, a Social Justice Hall of Fame, was published in July 2012 by Nation Books. And do you think we can get through all 100 of these today?
I doubt it, but let's start trying.
Okay. Great to have you here, Peter.
Thanks.
So I understand that this book actually got started as an article, correct, with only half the number of individuals included?
Yeah, 2 years ago I wrote an article. It was a cover story in The Nation magazine called The 50 Most Influential Progressives of the 20th Century. And there was an avalanche of response from Nation readers. I got a lot of emails. The magazine got a lot of emails and letters. And there were sort of two kinds of responses. One is, how dare you put this person on your list? And the other is, how dare you not put this person on your list? And so it generated a lot of controversy, a lot of conversation, which is what I really wanted to do when I wrote the article in the first place, get people talking about the history of American progressive politics and how we got to the point where the changes that we admire, the minimum wage and Social Security and the right for women to vote, were made possible not by some inevitable evolution of American society, but because people were struggling to make it happen. And so I thought, okay, well, let's try to make this into a book. And so 2 years later, we doubled the number of people to 100, and I expanded the biographies of the people in the book. And I hope people learn something from it.
Yeah, it's been an incredible read, really. Now, I'm curious, you mentioned you got all this response and mail from people. Did that influence who you ended up including in the book at all, or it was just sort of food for thought?
Well, getting down to 100 was really hard because I, originally had 50, but even getting down to 50 was really difficult. So the Nation readers had some good ideas, and so I reached out to biographers, to scholars, to historians, political scientists, to journalists. I cast a pretty wide net asking for advice about who were the 100 people, and I wanted to make sure that I covered all the important progressive movements of the 20th century, the labor movement, the women's rights movement, environmentalism, gay rights, and civil rights, obviously. And I wanted to make sure that I covered all the different time periods as well. So the book is kind of a snapshot of our history with the capsule biographies of people and an introductory chapter which puts it into historical context. It includes a timeline. And at the end of the book, there's a chapter on the 21st century because this is a movement and a tradition that's still going on.
Right. Now, I want to get to the sort of passing the torch thing a little bit later in the show. And I did notice that my guy, James Baldwin, got to your secondary list.
Well, I did cheat. I did cheat.
I saw that.
I have, in the introduction, I have a list of 50 people who I would have put in the book if I had more room.
Okay. Yeah. All right, fair enough.
Okay.
Now, I wanted to also mention, in your introduction, I thought it was really apt that you wrote that these were heroes, but flawed individuals. Why did you feel that was important to mention?
Well, A, because it's true, and B, because I don't think it's a good idea to put people on too high a pedestal, because then it makes other people feel like, well, I can't do that, right? And the purpose of the book is to inspire people to get involved or to stay involved in trying to change the world, and to point out that a lot of the radical ideas of 100 years ago, Social Security, a minimum wage, women's right to vote, giving workers the right to unionize, old age insurance, and environmental and consumer laws, those were once considered radical. These are things we take for granted today. And the people that brought us these laws, the movements that changed America, were made up of ordinary people as well as great people, but they were great because they rose to the occasion, not because they were perfect. And so, in the book I talk about how, for example, Alice Paul, who was one of the great women's suffrage leaders of the early 1900s. So without her persistence and her organizing skill, it would have taken a lot longer for women to get the right to vote. She was an anti-Semite. Yeah. And Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of what today is called Planned Parenthood, who invented the term birth control, who got arrested many times for passing out birth control literature back in the early 1900s, who opened the first birth control clinic in America in 1911 in New York. She flirted with the idea of eugenics, which is a kind of a racist idea about how we use or abuse science. And other people, like Lyndon Johnson, who I admire a great deal for his ability to move the civil rights agenda. As a president, he also was the one who expanded the war in Vietnam. Yeah. So on both a personal level and a political level, everybody in the book had flaws. And the question is, how do we measure their accomplishments so that we admire the things that they did as movement leaders and as activists and as writers and as politicians, but we don't ignore the fact that they were human beings who lived in a particular time?
Well, I think even if we look at, at today, or even more so today, individuals who are doing some amazing work, I mean, I think Van Jones would be a great individual to bring up now, in the sense that, what he's done with his environmental work and reintroducing the reality of the American dream, trying to put that back on the table. Mm-hmm. Yet, he was thrown under the bus, so to speak, and certain aspects of his, college life and, all of that. I mean, how would that relate to, the individuals in your book and that whole concept of, people can be heroes without having to be perfect?
Well, about a decade ago, somebody discovered that Martin Luther King had plagiarized part of his PhD dissertation when he was at Boston University. Well, I teach my students that plagiarism is a really serious problem. But does that diminish the incredible work that Martin Luther King did throughout his lifetime to bring about a better world, both in terms of civil rights and peace and other aspects of social justice? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. And Paul Wellstone, who was a hero of mine, who died 10 years ago in a plane crash, when he was in the U.S. Senate, he was probably the most progressive person in the Senate at the time, and yet he voted in favor of the Defense of Marriage Act, which was at the time the opposition of same-sex marriage act. And I don't think he would do that today, because we've changed as a society. But at the time, that's what he honestly believed. He was, he was kind of traditional in his views about marriage. And so people criticized him for it, and justly so. But that doesn't diminish the fact that Paul Wellstone was a remarkable hero. And I think that, as you said, today we have access to the internet. We can find out all kinds of, quote, skeletons in people's closets, right. But we have to figure out what's the sum of their life, as opposed to, can we find flaws, in everybody, and then try to diminish their accomplishments. I think we have to be able to see, on balance, how do these people contribute to making America more democratic, a more just, and a more equal society. And the 100 people I picked in my book are all people who, on balance, made enormous contributions to making this a better world and a better society.
Right. Well, I'd like to reference a few more people in the book. I know you have a great affinity for Pete Seeger. Mm-hmm. So what's your stance on any particular award that should be bestowed on him?
Okay.
Hint, hint.
Okay. Well, there are three kinds of people that I describe in the book. One are activists and organizers, people who are on the front lines of movements, union organizers, and people that that mobilize other people. Then there are politicians who translated these radical ideas into public policy. And then there are writers and singers and playwrights and theologians who inspired us with their music, their art, and their words to think about the possibilities of a better world. And no one did that better than Pete Seeger. No one has done that better than Pete Seeger. He's 93 years old. He's been doing this for over 70 years. He's brought people around the world closer together through his music. Today we call it world music, but he didn't call it that when he began. And so, he was on the picket lines in the labor movement, in the civil rights movement, in the environmental movement. He's probably more responsible than anyone else for cleaning up the Hudson River. His songs like In the Jungle, Wimoweh, and Guantanamero and Saint Etcena taught people about other cultures. And in terms of his accomplishments, I think Pete Seeger has done more than anyone else to tell people that we all have more in common than we have different, and that the things that unite us are greater than the things that divide us. And in that way, I think he deserves more than anyone else to get the Nobel Peace Prize. And there have been attempts to build a movement to nominate him, and I think now is the right time to do that for someone who's 93 years old.
Right, you can appreciate it. Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Well, I really have to say that I loved the chapter on Alice Hamilton. Mm-hmm. And I just want to reference a section of your book where you state that in 1893, she earned her medical degree from the University of Michigan. After her internships, she went to Munich and Leipzig in Germany, where she could attend lectures if she promised to remain inconspicuous to male students and professors.
She's the kind of person in the book that not many people have heard of, mm-hmm. but who deserves to be famous. Mm-hmm. So as you said, she went to medical school in the turn of the century, mm-hmm. turn of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Today, about half of all the students in med school are women, but back then it was less than 2%. And she was more than a doctor, though. Her patient was the working class. Mm-hmm. And she invented the entire field of occupational medicine. She realized that many of her patients, working class, mostly immigrant men and women, were getting sick, and their children were getting sick because of the chemicals and the other dangerous aspects of their jobs in the industrial factories in the mm-hmm. early 1900s. And she set about to expose this injustice and to demand that the employers and the government of the United States impose standards on workplace health and safety. Now, today we take it for granted. We have a federal law that was passed in 1970 called OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. But back then, this was an incredibly radical idea that the government should require companies to have safe workplaces. And so she was more than just a researcher. She was a crusader. She lived at Hull House, which was a settlement house in New York, in Chicago, where Jane Addams, the great heroine of social work, lived. Right. And so she used her medical knowledge and her organizing skills to build political momentum to change the way we think about work. And then she got a job at the Harvard Medical School. She was the first woman to be on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School. But as you suggested, they imposed some standards on her when she took the job. She wasn't allowed to go to football games. She wasn't allowed to march in the graduation, mm-hmm. and she wasn't allowed to eat in the faculty dining room. And she had her own quid pro quo for taking the job. She said, I'll only teach half the year, and the other half I want to go back to Chicago and do my research and live at Hull House. And so mm-hmm. She was a great pioneer. And she died in 1970, the same year that Congress passed the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And there are millions and millions of Americans who have avoided dangerous injuries and even death because of the work that Alice Hamilton did. She deserves to be in the pantheon of great American heroes.
Yeah, wonderful that you included her, as well as Jane Addams in the book, I should note. Well, and speaking of Martin Luther King Jr., who, of course, is in your book, one thing I thought was sort of fascinating, and not just with Martin Luther King, but with other individuals. When I learned about him in school, my school-age daughters are, we learned how he was prominent, leadership role in the civil rights movement, of course, and so many of his famous speeches, besides the I Have a Dream speech. However, it wasn't until I was an adult, actually, that I learned about his role in the anti-war movement and fighting against the war in Vietnam, as well as others, Helen Keller, very political, anti-war. And I just wonder what your take is on this being sort of written out of their own histories. And doesn't that do a disservice to their lives as political activists?
Well, Martin Luther King was 26 years old and had just taken his first job as a minister in Montgomery, Alabama, when the bus boycott began. And he wasn't the instigator of the bus boycott. And it was Rosa Parks and a guy named E.D. Nixon, who was a longtime civil rights activist, and a woman named Joanne Robinson. They really got the boycott started. And they were looking for someone who could be the public spokesperson of the movement. And so they picked this young minister who had just come from Boston, where he'd gotten his graduate degree. And he was a great public speaker, but he had no experience as an activist or as an organizer. And so he had to learn how to do that. And he was mentored by some of the people in my book, James Lawson and Baird Rustin and others. And then he became the Martin Luther King that we all know, the person who helped to inspire other people with his speeches. It started expanding the civil rights movement to other cities outside Montgomery. But then he began to realize that the pace of change in America for both civil rights and anti-poverty was being hampered by the fact that the country was spending much too much money on the military-industrial complex. And he wanted to speak out against the war in Vietnam and about the militarism that was keeping America from solving its domestic problems. And at first he was reluctant to do that because he had a pretty good relationship with some of the liberal Democrats in Congress, including President Johnson, who were advocating for civil rights and anti-poverty legislation, but who were also supporting the war in Vietnam. So he decided in 1967 to break from that Democratic leadership and to come out in favor of withdrawal from Vietnam. And he gave a famous speech at a church in New York, the Riverside Church, where he came out and he said that the bombs that we drop in Vietnam fall in our cities because we're spending a lot too much money in Vietnam and not enough money in our cities. And he got a lot of criticism from some of his fellow civil rights activists for saying that this was a bad idea because he was going to undermine his relationship with people who supported civil rights legislation. But he said he had a moral responsibility to do that. And that's part of the reason I wrote the book, was to give people a full review of some of the people that we know about. We know their names and we don't know their whole history. And as you said, Helen Keller is another one. Mm-hmm. Our image of Helen Keller is kind of frozen when she was 7 years old. A blind girl who was being taught by a woman named Anne Sullivan how to overcome her blindness and how to learn how to speak and how to identify objects and how to read in Braille. And her parents were quite wealthy and they could afford to have a tutor help her. So eventually she went to Radcliffe College and she became radicalized by doing research that found out that blindness is much more prevalent among poor people. And she wondered, why is that the case? And so she did her own investigations and she eventually became a socialist. She was active in the women's suffrage movement. She campaigned for Eugene Debs. She was active in the peace movement, and she was very active in labor issues. And yet, you know, our image of Helen Keller is frozen because of the famous movie The Miracle Worker, which is her sort of biography, but it stops when she's 7 years old. So there are a lot of people in the book who people know about, Helen Keller being one of them, Martin Luther King, Dr. Seuss, the children's writer, Albert Einstein, who had a much broader and more political view of the world than the traditional histories give them credit for.
Now, you mentioned Dr. Seuss just a moment ago. Would you indulge me and read a poem of Dr. Seuss's, who not many realize he was, I would call him a radical.
Dr. Seuss's real name was Theodore Geisel, and what many people don't know about him was that he was a radical. And during World War II, he was a cartoonist for the left-wing newspaper PM, which was published in New York. It lasted about a decade. And when he began writing children's books, some of them were just children's books, you know, were designed to help children improve their vocabularies. But most of them had social messages, and that for the last 50 years, American and parents all over the world have been reading these stories to their children, some of them perhaps not knowing that there are messages within those stories that are about social justice. For example, the Butter Battle book is about the nuclear arms race, about how two sides are, you know, how crazy it is. The two sides are trying to outdo each other with bigger and bigger weapons. And The Lorax, which is today a popular movie.
But that's pretty overt, wouldn't you say?
That's pretty overt, about the business corruption of the environment. And The Sneetches is about anti-Semitism. And one of my favorites is Yertle the Turtle. Yertle the Turtle is a children's story based on, it's an allegory about Hitler and about bullies and about people that abuse other people. And so if you remember the story, it's about Yertle, who's the king of the turtles, who is able to climb up to the top and see his kingdom because he's got people on a pyramid below the other turtles that he's abusing.
And there's like a big stack of all the turtles.
There's a big stack of turtles. And so he writes from the point of view of the people at the bottom. I don't like to complain, but down here below, we are feeling great pain. I know up on top you are seeing great sights, but down at the bottom, yes, we too should have rights. And later, of course, the whole thing comes crashing down. And that's Dr. Seuss telling children, don't let people bully you, stick up for yourself, work together collectively to try to build a better world, but don't let other people take advantage of you. And so in Dr. Seuss's books, children are learning sometimes overtly and sometimes more subtly and covertly about questioning authority, questioning their parents sometimes, and challenging the way that the world is organized. And Dr. Seuss was a remarkable writer because he had a great facility with words, but he also had a great facility with ideas, and his ideas were progressive and radical.
If we look at some of the earlier individuals in the book, the people who, you know, in the moldings of our country, the early 1900s, and I like the way you put it. We're all on their shoulders in a sense. How would you view the people who are really doing amazing work now, and what are some of the difficulties in this day and age?
Yeah, well, centuries are kind of arbitrary, right? I mean, the movement for social justice doesn't end in 1999 or in the year 2000. Right. And so there are a lot of people working in the last decade, the 21st century, who've been continuing the tradition of social justice activism. And some of the people that I mentioned in the last chapter of the book that I call the 21st century so far include a woman named I-Jen Poo, who is a leader of the National Association of Domestic Workers. And she's responsible for, she's a community organizer, and she started this organization in New York, which is now spread to many states, to get basic workplace rights for nannies and housekeepers and domestic workers who don't fall under the federal labor laws. There's another guy in the book named Lucas Benitez, who's the founder of something called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which are tomato pickers in Florida who have been abused by the growers, by the agricultural industry, and he's organized them with consumer groups to improve the working conditions among tomato pickers in Florida. He's kind of the Cesar Chavez of the 21st century. There's a politician in New York named Brad Lander who has been a community organizer for 20 years, and he just got elected to the New York City Council, where he's continuing to do organizing work, but he's doing it inside City Hall, but he's working as an ally for the community groups in New York that are working for affordable housing and better working conditions for workers and living wage laws and things like that. So there are people all over this country in every city that are doing incredible organizing work through environmental organizations, community groups, labor unions, women's rights groups, and they stand on the shoulders of the people that I talk about in the book. But someday, someone will write a book like mine for the 21st century called The 100 Greatest Americans of the 21st Century, and I wanted to give a hint of that, who are some of the candidates that might wind up in that book, and some of the ideas that today we think are radical, like, for example, the idea of ending the death penalty, or same-sex marriage, or universal health insurance for everyone, or an end to global warming. Maybe my children or grandchildren will live in a world where they look back and say, I can't believe that we still had the death penalty in America back then. You know, that's a radical idea today, but it might be common sense 50 years from now. And if we have that perspective, that people involved in social justice movements have to be long distance runners. They can't be sprinters. They have to think about this as something for the long haul. Then we can understand that the unfolding of America over the last 100 years or so, and the continuing unfolding of America for the next 50 or 100 years, is going to require all of us, if we're going to build a better world, to get involved in these movements for justice.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank you again for being on the show.
It's a pleasure.
Terrific. And I want to ask you also, now, if someone wants to find out how they can buy the book, find out more about these various people that you've included in the book, how can they find you and get the book?
Well, we have a website called 100greatestamericans.org where they can go to learn more about the book. You can get the book online at most of the online bookstores, but I prefer people to buy it in independent bookstores in their hometowns. And at the end of the book, in the last chapter, at the end, there's a bibliography about each of the people in the book where they can learn more about each of these people, and there's even a list of movies, both documentaries and Hollywood films, that have been made about some of the people in the book. And so if they want to learn more about the people, they can go online, or they can look at the last chapter of the book. And it makes a good birthday gift and a good graduation gift. It's for people that want to remind themselves about the history of this country and the way, the kinds of people that made this a great country. And it's great for people that don't know anything yet, because it's written in sort of bite-sized chapters of 4 or 5 pages each.
Great. Well, I hope you will come back when we do the sequel. And thanks again. And thank you for joining us. For more information about our programs and to answer a brief online survey, go to pressfordemocracy.com. You can also find us on Facebook. And join us again as we press for democracy.